Hello and welcome to Track Changes. I'm Franziska Curran and I'm recording on the Yagara and Turrbal lands in Mianjin or Brisbane. And I'm here with Murray Griffin. Hello, Murray Griffin.
Hello, Franziska, and I'm on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. And it's a very exciting episode today, Franziska. Do you want to sort of tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So today is the launch of the Track Changes dejargonator, which is a very recently developed fantastic piece of technology to improve and address the issue of communication, that challenge of communicating to the everyday Australian.
Yes, and developed by Track Changes' very own science and engineering team.
Division.
So we're division. Yes. So we're very thrilled to be having this test run. Slightly nervous, but nevertheless, quietly confident. But the proof is in the pudding, and we'll see how it goes.
Murray, do you want to talk a little bit about why we're doing this or where this idea came from?
Yes. Okay. Well, the reason we put the Track Changes Science and Engineering and Technology Division to work on this task is because we both have a strong interest in communication. And I was thinking about this as we were preparing this episode, and I was thinking about the importance of talking unprofessionally about climate and environment. And I guess, and what I mean by that is that people who are climate and environment professionals need to be able to talk plainly about what they do and what they've learnt, because it's important not to just use jargon that only other professionals can understand. Those of us who are not experts want and need to be able to understand what experts do and what they know. And, I think that also extends to the platforms that experts use, because it's not enough to stick to the walled gardens of LinkedIn, much as we all,
the walled gardens. That's such a rosy wave.
Yeah, we all love them. We all love it. But, in particular,
yeah.
Don't you agree? Like, I think people need to push a bit beyond that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And in particular, I think we need to see a lot more organisations, companies and consultancies making use of YouTube and making use of it in a creative way, which is actually not that hard to do. So anyway, that was sort of the thinking behind this particular episode, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think for me in this world that increasingly it feels like people live in silos and we're not talking the same language often, even if we're talking about the same thing. And we all look at problems from different angles. And I think it's such an art to be able to bridge the gap between, the language that certain people use and other people's understanding. And I'm very passionate about this because I lecture about climate change and net zero pathways for businesses.
Yeah.
And while I spend a lot of time in the detail. You know me. I love my carbon accounting and my safeguard mechanism and all of that. But it has to be accessible so that we can get everyone on board. We desperately will always need technical experts, but we need everyone on for the journey as well. So that's kind of my angle to this. And I actually thought maybe the dejargonator came from some previous episodes where maybe I've been caught too much in the detail and
do you know?
No. You've thought, let's just sort of lift it up and make it more accessible.
No, not at all. Although one phrase does stick with me from an episode that we did some time ago, which was on liars and blockers. It was called climate disinformation. And there was a phrase that one of the guests on the panel used, which is that we're all climate communicators now. And she was making the point that it's so important for us all to be able to talk about these things. And yeah, I guess that really resonated with me. And I think it's something that we all need to keep in mind. But maybe we should talk now about how we're testing the dejargonator, or in fact, who is going to test it for us. So.
Yes, Murray. Well, we're very lucky to have Mark Tilley join us from Carbon Pulse. So Mark Tilley is the Asia Pacific editor for Carbon Pulse. And we've asked Mark to step into our dejargonator and explain some concepts for us around carbon and the carbon market and carbon policy to help reach a broader audience.
Yes, and it is a real test for the dejargonator and for Mark, because the carbon market, as we all know, is a very complex
It's not
beast.
very simple.
No,
No, that's
it's
right.
not.
And, on a very fundamental and human level, the carbon market is extremely confusing. Like, we're talking about something you can't feel or see or touch, then having a sort of a weight that we attribute and trade and capture and monitor, like carbon emissions, it's as itself is a strange concept. And now we've got a whole market around it. So thankfully, Mark Tilley is going to make it all clear.
Yeah.
With the help of the dejargonator.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's go to our test session with Mark.
Hello, Mark Tilley, and welcome to Track Change's Dejargonator episode. How are you going today?
Hi, Francisco. Yeah, good, thanks. It's good to be here.
Fantastic. It is really good to have you because this is a very exciting and an alternative format for the day. Do you want to kick off by giving us a very short overview of who you are and maybe why we would have asked you to do this today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the Asia Pacific editor for Carbon Pulse. I've been writing about carbon markets and climate policy for the last 4 years. So I'm in no way, shape or form an expert, but I have a pretty solid understanding of how these schemes functioned. And given that my job is to explain the ins and outs of these schemes, seems like it'd be a good idea to have a crack at doing that for you guys.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And we're grateful for your bravery in testing this new technology, which, as you know, was developed by the Science and Engineering Division of Track Changes. But you are, I think, an excellent candidate to test the dejargonator because, you're familiar with some of the extraordinarily complex language that crops up in carbon markets. Terms like additionality, terms like permanence, Article 6, CBAM and spot trading. You can throw them around with the best of them, can't you?
I try and, refrain from jargon as much as possible day to day. I'll do my best to break it down.
Yes, well, as you know, Mark, the dejargonator is a brand new machine. It's not been tested by humans before, so we're grateful for your bravery and your willingness to undertake this test. We have a list of questions, so then we will take it in turns to ask you those questions. So maybe now, if you could step into the booth and we'll get started.
And if at any time we get an indication that the dejargonator is malfunctioning, we will reset and maybe ask the question again. You're in a hot seat there, Mark.
Wish me luck.
Okay.
Good luck.
Good luck. Yes.
I'm ready to kick off. Are you ready, Mark?
Yeah.
Alrighty. Question 1, Mark. What is a carbon market?
So a carbon market is like any kind of financial market or similar to a financial market or commodity market where goods are bought and sold, but instead of physical products being traded like steel or oil or gold, you instead are trading carbon credits.
Seems to be working so far.
It seems to be working just fine, Francisco.
Over to you, Murray.
Those scientists and technologists, scientists and engineers can feel very proud.
Relieved.
So question 2, Mark, what are carbon credits and are they the same as carbon offsets?
So a carbon credit is a financial instrument representing 1 ton of CO2 equivalent avoided or removed from the atmosphere. Asking if there's a difference between a carbon credit and a carbon offset is kind of asking the wrong question because carbon credits can be used to offset emissions that an entity creates, but offsetting isn't necessarily the only thing carbon credits can be used for. So it depends on what system these credits are operating in. My best way to describe this is the carbon credit is the noun and the carbon offsetting is the adjective, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Yep.
There is a difference, however, between what is known as a carbon credit and a carbon allowance. So allowances also represent 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, but they act as a sort of permission slip to pollute. So 1 carbon allowance would allow a company to emit 1 ton of CO2, whereas a carbon credit being used for offsetting purposes means that that credit is being used to theoretically make up for the 1 ton of CO2 that has already been emitted.
Thank you, Mark. And Francisco, I think our technology is proving highly successful. Over to you for the next question.
It is proving highly successful. We could calibrate some thresholds in the future if we needed to, but I think it's
Yes.
working so far. Mark, how do organizations create carbon credits, and who creates them?
So carbon credits are created by carrying out additional eligible activities that avoid or remove emissions from the atmosphere. So those sorts of activities can be another number of things depending on which market or system you're operating in. So example, a really obvious one is planting trees and vegetation that draws carbon from the atmosphere as it grows. Another example is what happens in Australia, which is called savanna fire management, which draws on indigenous practices of carrying out cool, low-intensity burns across landscapes, which help reduce the fuel load and avoid much more intense wildfires later on, which is then classified as an emissions avoidance. So there are a number of activities across all different schemes that theoretically are designed to avoid or remove emissions from the atmosphere, and those then become eligible to earn carbon credits as a result. So there are specialized project developers that work with land managers and property owners and the like who help get projects off the ground. They are supposed to make sure that the activities that are being carried out to reduce or avoid emissions meet the requirements that the overall scheme that it operates under requires to ensure that those credits that are being earned are legitimate.
Moving on, who buys carbon credits and why? And what's the difference between a voluntary carbon market and a compliance carbon market? Double header question there, Mark.
Yeah, so the motivation behind who would buy a carbon credit greatly depends upon whether that entity exists in a voluntary market or a compliance market, or is participating in a voluntary market or a compliance market. So in broad terms, a voluntary carbon market is where actors buy and surrender carbon credits to meet targets or emissions reductions targets or sustainability goals that they have set for themselves. So it's, as the name suggests, a purely voluntary action on their behalf. So no one is telling them that they have to, but they do it anyway. Whereas a compliance market, meanwhile, is when an actor has a legal obligation to buy and surrender carbon credits or allowances in order to usually meet a broader economy or sector-specific emissions target that a governing body, such as a government or a framework or whatever, is trying to get those group of actors to work towards. So the companies that historically have bought the largest share of carbon credits, generally speaking, they are energy companies. However, they are being bought and sold and by all kinds of companies, governments, institutions, even events themselves for a variety of reasons. So sometimes they may have voluntary emissions reductions targets they want to meet, and they buy and surrender credits to meet those targets. They do this because it's the cheapest and easiest option. And as a business, that's often something that's hard to resist. Other times, entities have a target they want to meet. However, they say there isn't a viable technology or solution available that's cost-effective enough to reduce their emissions on site. So they resort to carbon credits because they want to contribute to reducing or avoid emissions elsewhere. As I said before, other times entities are legally required to either reduce their emissions or buy and surrender credits instead as part of a wider emissions trading scheme. And as a result, they would be compelled to buy and surrender those credits in order to avoid repercussion.
Okay, well,
Excellent.
excellent. Yes, I must say, Francisco, I'm very, very pleased about how the technology is performing. Over to you.
I hope the Science and Technology Division of Track Changes is also pleased.
I'm sure they are.
Our next question is getting even more complex, Mark. How do carbon markets and carbon credits help us fight climate change?
This is where things get very tricky because there's a lot of debate about this. Advocates for carbon markets say that because we're not going to solve climate change by cutting gross or on-site emissions everywhere across the economy, there is always going to be an element of residual emissions that are going to be needed to be accounted for if we're going to reach net zero by 2050 or achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, carbon markets can help scale up the kind of emissions removal and avoidance activities we need to balance out the emissions that are going to be impossible to avoid. Many also emphasize that carbon markets are just one part of the wider puzzle, and that alongside that, efforts need to be made to work to cut emissions across the economy as quickly as possible with things like electrification, fuel switching, and transitioning away from fossil fuel. However, others argue that these markets are simply in place to prolong the use of fossil fuels by creating frameworks that allow them to continue to pollute for longer. And they say that carbon credits themselves as instruments can be inherently risky because of a range of factors, meaning that it can be hard to quantify whether the emissions avoided or removed a credit is supposed to represent has actually occurred. So the critics of the carbon markets often argue that our efforts would be better spent elsewhere, focusing on transitioning away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and as well as focusing on things like electrification and that sort of thing. Basically because they say it's far easier to avoid creating emissions in the first place than it is to draw them back out of the atmosphere once they have been emitted.
We'll head back to the dejargonator in a minute. If you're enjoying Track Changes, there's a couple of things you can do to help us grow. Firstly, hit subscribe or follow. And we'd also love it if you give us a star rating on Apple or Spotify, or a thumbs up on YouTube, because those stars and thumbs up help put this episode in front of more people. And just a reminder to check out our other podcast called Earthed, which drops every Tuesday and rounds up Australia's main climate and sustainability news developments of the week. Plus, there's the Earthed newsletter, which you can find at earthed.au. Now, back to the dejargonator. So next up, Mark, why do carbon prices change over time? And what makes some types of credits more expensive than others?
So carbon prices are different depending on what scheme they function in. So in Australia, for example, there are multiple activities that generate carbon credits, and some of those are more expensive to carry out than others. For example, planting native trees and managing them so that they grow enough to absorb CO2 is more expensive than carrying out, for example, a landfill gas project. So therefore, the cost of carbon credit from a tree plantings project is going to be more expensive as a result. Carbon prices can also change over time due to supply and demand factors, similar to other markets. So if there is a huge supply of carbon credits in a market that are readily available, the price for them isn't necessarily going to be that high. If there's a shortage, then prices go up. So yeah, as I said, similar sort of dynamics compared to other markets. Unlike other markets, however, carbon markets in many cases are entirely political instruments. That is to say, they are made up by governments or governing bodies in order to manage emissions. So prices can be extremely sensitive to announcements, political statements, policy change, and the like. So for an example, if there was a country that had an existing carbon market and a popular opposition leader came along and said, we're going to tear this all up, we don't need it, ahead of an election, carbon prices would likely go down because people would say, well, this new popular leader is coming in and they say they don't want it, so we don't need to participate in this anymore. Let's get out of here, basically. This is obviously all very theoretical.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's different from than a physical commodity market because there isn't a natural supply and demand for products that are traded in this market. It's entirely invented, basically. And so therefore it can be very sensitive to things that political leaders or governing bodies come out and say.
And Mark, how do we know that carbon credits represent real reductions in carbon pollution?
So carbon market critics argue that many of the activities carried out to generate credits have a vast amount of variables and risk factors that basically make it impossible to guarantee that they represent real reductions in pollution. So it's an evolving science that has seen some pretty damning evidence over the years, but then there has also been a lot of studies attempting to sort of counter that, and it's this sort of scientific debate has then progressed out into the media, and it's become a highly contested space, basically, and it does attract a lot of scrutiny. There are governments and market standards and the like that have systems and bodies in place that are supposed to ensure that carbon credits issued do in fact represent real reductions or avoided emissions that would not have occurred otherwise as accurately as possible. These include using independent assessors. In the international market, it's known as validation and verification bodies. There are third-party auditors. There are scientific experts on panels and bodies that are assessing activities that are being used to generate credits and the like. They are supposed to basically go through a list or sort of to independently verify that the activities that are being carried out by these projects are in fact occurring before the credits are issued. But like any system made by humans, unfortunately, there are inherent weaknesses, ways that these frameworks can be gamed and exploited, and gaps in oversight that do occur. And as a result, there have been, instances of malpractice. General bad market behavior does occur, similar to other markets. And as a result, the market's reputation suffers as a result. Reputations are damaged, trust is lost, and it can be very hard to earn that back.
All right. Well, one last question, and it's a particularly complex question. We're testing the technology to the hilt here. What is an environmental market, and how is it different from a carbon market?
Oof, it's a big one.
So an environmental market is similar to a carbon market, but instead of trading carbon, you are trading what is known as environmental products. So they can represent things like water, for example, or improvements in biodiversity. Similarly, they can be used by actors to offset environmental impacts occurred elsewhere. So again, in Australia, for example, there's a biodiversity offsetting scheme in various states where project proponents, sort of land developers and the like, if they are doing damage, unavoidable damage to a certain ecosystem in order for their development to go ahead, theoretically, they can then go ahead and invest in an offsetting project that is meant to sort of make up for the damage that they're inflicting in the ecosystem where their development is occurring. So biodiversity markets more broadly, which is, generating so-called biodiversity credits that companies can buy to, meet sustainability goals, for example, they're very nascent at this stage and slow to emerge because they're finding it to be as you can imagine, a very difficult concept to define and quantify. Things like, an improvement on biodiversity, for example, which is, as I said, harder to define compared to, say, as opposed to removing or avoiding 1 ton of CO2 equivalent out of the atmosphere. There's also, broader philosophical debates going on, I suppose you could say at the same time, given that there are questions being asked of like, are these kind of markets and frameworks commodifying nature to work within sort of a market-based framework, and can nature really be sort of quantified in such a way? And is this actually going to solve the challenges that we have created for ourselves in terms of climate change and biodiversity loss? So the question remains to be answered. So we'll just have to, see how it all unfolds.
Terrific, Mark. Thanks so much. Now you can feel free to step out of the dejargonator. And while you do, Francisco, I think look at the triumphant look on the faces of the scientists and engineers who have been watching nervously as this test of the technology has gone on.
Absolutely. How fantastic. What a win.
Thanks so much. And just a serious question, Mark, because in fact you are an excellent communicator on these issues. And people do talk a lot about climate change, disinformation and misinformation, but there can also be poor climate communication. And I wonder if you had any general thoughts, on a serious note, in terms of what people need to do to improve the way they communicate about these quite complex issues and the importance of communicating on those issues in a better way.
I think then probably is some need for perhaps some cool heads, I suppose you could say, because obviously, the issue of climate change and biodiversity loss, these are very sort of frightening and emotive topics that are quite sort of distressing. It's a difficult topic to sort of broach in an objective way. And I think you need to try and sort of assess things in ways that reflect a range of findings and a range of different sort of scenarios and try and sort the facts from the hyperbole. It's something that I sort of struggle with sometimes because, it's obviously a very tense debate. I think reaching out, relying on qualified and sort of reliable information sources that are from a range of backgrounds gives you a more clearer understanding and a clearer picture of the realities of what we can do, what some of the benefits and drawbacks of some things versus others. I mean, it's a tricky topic because it covers so many vast parts of almost all aspects of our lives, really. And so it's very multifaceted. And so I think you just have to sort of try and stay clear-headed and I guess try and be as objective as you can. But obviously that's, not entirely, that's an impossible thing to ask, really.
Well, that's a great answer. Well, Mark, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Mark.
My pleasure. My pleasure, Francisca. Thank you, Murray. It was always a pleasure to be on.
I thought dejargonator Mark did a fantastic job, Francisca, didn't you?
Absolutely fantastic testing of our technology, but also, really appreciate Mark for his insights and time and being able to lay it out for us the way he has. So we've covered off on many interesting topics in this session.
Yep, absolutely. And by the way, it's exactly what you would expect from Mark, very clear communication, given that he's a terrific climate and environmental journalist.
Yeah.
So big thanks to Mark for participating today. And big thanks to you all for listening. We'll see you again next time. Bye for now.
Soon.